A crowded bus. A young man berates his elderly mother in front of strangers until a quiet military veteran steps in, changing everything with his words. What followed left everyone speechless. The bus was packed, every seat filled, and the aisles were crowded with standing passengers, each gripping the metal poles for stability. It was just another typical late afternoon in Birmingham, Alabama, the air thick with the smell of diesel and the low hum of chatter creating a familiar background noise. In one of the middle rows, a young man in his early 20s sat, sharp-featured and brimming with self-importance. His voice cut through the ambient noise of the bus. "How could you forget that, Mum? This is so embarrassing," he snapped, gesturing angrily. Next to him, his mother, an elderly woman with silver hair and tired, kind eyes, fiddled nervously with the strap of her purse, avoiding the gazes of the others. "I'm sorry, Smith," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I thought I put it in the bag before we left." Smith groaned loudly, throwing his head back in exasperation. "You always do this. It's like you can't remember anything. No wonder Dad gave up on you." A few passengers who overheard gasped. A woman near them shot a disapproving glance, while a man at the back muttered something under his breath, but no one intervened. Yet. At the back of the bus, a tall black man sat with his hands resting calmly on his knees, his military uniform sharp and neat. His name tag read Gaines, though no one took notice. His presence was commanding, though silent, and the rows of medals on his chest hinted at years of service. His face was unreadable, but his gaze never wavered from the scene unfolding in front of him. As Smith's voice grew louder, berating his mother for something she had forgotten, Gaines' expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened ever so slightly. The elderly woman's hands trembled as she adjusted her glasses, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Please, Smith, not here. Let's talk about this later." Smith snapped back, his voice booming across the bus. "You just don't get it, do you? You ruin everything." No wonder. The tension in the air grew thick, and passengers exchanged uneasy glances. A teenager discreetly pulled out her phone, pretending to scroll but clearly angling it to capture the drama unfolding. The bus was quiet, everyone waiting for something to happen, something to break the uncomfortable silence. From his seat, Gaines let out a slow breath, the sound cutting through the tension. His eyes flicked from the elderly woman to Smith, his posture still and composed but radiating quiet intensity. The air felt heavy, like the whole bus was holding its breath, waiting for someone to act. Smith's voice continued to rise, his words sharper with each insult. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, the hushed conversations dying out. The bus, once a neutral space, now felt suffocating, filled with the weight of Smith's cruelty. "Can't you do anything right?" Smith sneered, leaning in closer to his mother, who shrank further into her seat. "You're so useless sometimes." The elderly woman flinched, but said nothing. Her hands clutched her purse tightly, like it was her only source of comfort. Her gaze remained fixed on the floor, her lips pressed tightly together. This wasn't the first time she'd been humiliated by her son, but the public nature of it made it sting all the more. Her shoulders slumped even further, as though she wanted to disappear completely, hiding from both the cruel words and the harsh stares. A man in his 30s, standing near the front of the bus, subtly adjusted his tie while casting a furtive glance backward. His expression was a mix of indignation and uncertainty, unsure whether to intervene or remain silent. The woman sitting next to him leaned over and whispered, someone should step in, but no one moved.
"Not yet."
At the back of the bus, Gaines shifted in his seat, his posture straight and unshaken. His eyes, dark and piercing, were fixed firmly on Smith, studying him with an intensity that seemed neither angry nor judgmental, but instead focused and calculating. The stillness in Gaines' demeanor contrasted sharply with the building tension in the bus. Though he said nothing, his presence alone seemed to fill the space with an undeniable gravity, as if he was waiting for the right moment to act. Smith's voice cracked, his anger rising to a boiling point. "This is why Dad left. You're a disaster. You always have been, he shouted, the words cutting through the bus like a whip. The harshness of his words struck every passenger, making the silence afterward feel like a vacuum. The elderly woman's face crumpled in response, a tear slipping down her cheek before she quickly wiped it away, trying to mask the pain. But it was too late. Everyone saw. A wave of discomfort swept across the bus, the atmosphere heavy with shared unease. The passengers, who had been feigning indifference, now couldn't look away. A teenager, capturing the moment on her phone, leaned over to her friend, whispering, "This is going viral." Her friend, however, shook her head and muttered, "It's just heartbreaking." Gaines' posture grew more resolute. His hands gripped the edge of his seat, his eyes focused and unblinking, now prepared to act. Smith, oblivious to the shift in the air, was ready to launch into another tirade when a soft, commanding voice broke through. "Excuse me, young man," came a voice from a few rows ahead. An older woman turned in her seat, her expression stern and disapproving. "Don't you think that's enough?" Smith froze, taken aback by the interruption. His face twisted in anger. "This isn't your business, lady," he spat, his tone sharp and full of venom. Before the situation could escalate, Gaines stood up. His presence was undeniable. Standing tall, his uniform crisp and immaculate, the calm authority radiating from him commanded the attention of every passenger in the bus. With measured steps, Gaines walked toward Smith. The silence was deafening, the only sound the low hum of the engine. As Gaines approached, the defiance in Smith's posture seemed to drain away. The young man instinctively recoiled, shrinking back in his seat, feeling the weight of Gaines's stare. The passengers, who had been waiting for something to happen, now held their breath, watching intently. When Gaines reached Smith, he stopped just a few feet away, his towering presence casting a shadow over the young man. First, he looked at Smith, then his gaze shifted to the elderly woman, whose cheeks were now streaked with tears. Taking a deep, deliberate breath, Gaines spoke in a voice that was steady and unwavering. "I wasn't going to say anything," Gaines began, his voice calm but firm. "But watching this, that's something I can't allow." Smith, momentarily stunned, tried to recover with his usual arrogance. "What? You're going to lecture me now," he sneered, though his voice faltered slightly under the weight of Gaines's unwavering gaze. Gaines ignored the challenge, his eyes never leaving the mother, still trembling in her seat. Gaines crouched down slightly, bringing himself to the level of the elderly woman's eyes. "Ma'am," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of experience, "you deserve respect, especially from your own family." His words, though gentle, carried a commanding presence, and the entire bus seemed to lean in, listening intently. He then stood up straight and turned back to Smith. His tone shifted, becoming more firm, yet still controlled. "You remind me of someone I used to know," Gaines said, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Someone who thought they had all the time in the world to apologize." Smith blinked, confusion clouding his face. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice defensive and tinged with uncertainty. Gaines tilted his head slightly, his expression unreadable. "I served 20 years in the military, saw things you wouldn't believe, did things that still haunt me every day," he said quietly, forcing the passengers to lean in, eager to catch his every word. "But nothing haunts me more than the day I buried my mother." The bus fell into an absolute silence. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade into the background, leaving only Gaines's voice to fill the void. He continued, his tone heavy with sorrow. "I was a young man, full of pride, thinking I knew everything. She'd call me, ask how I was doing, and I'd brush her off. 'I'm busy, Mom,' I'd say. 'I'll call you later.' But later never came. One day, I got the call she was gone." Smith shifted uneasily in his seat, his bravado faltering. Gaines took a slow step forward, his voice dropping even lower, his words now carrying the weight of personal experience. "Do you know what it's like to stand over a casket, wishing you could just have one more chance to tell her you're sorry? To tell her she mattered? To say, 'I love you,' but it's too late." The silence was suffocating, the weight of Gaines's words pressing down on everyone. The elderly woman wiped her eyes with trembling hands, her lips pressed together as though trying to hold back a sob. Gaines leaned slightly toward Smith, his voice now sharp, a quiet urgency behind it. Don't be the kind of man who waits until it's too late. That's a regret you'll carry forever. Smith's face flushed, his mouth opening, but no words coming out. His hands clenched the fabric of his jeans, and his head lowered in a mixture of shame and realization. The bus, which had been a cacophony of tension moments before, was now still, frozen in the heavy silence. Then, Smith broke the silence, and it wasn't what anyone had expected. Slowly, he raised his head, his eyes meeting Gaines's. The defiance had drained from his face, replaced by vulnerability. His voice cracked as he spoke, the words tentative and raw. I didn't mean, he paused, swallowing hard. I didn't mean to hurt her. The words hung in the air, fragile and full of emotion. His mother's eyes widened in surprise, her lips trembling as she processed what he was saying, but she remained silent, her emotions too deep for words. Gaines's gaze remained steady, unwavering. Then say it, he urged, his voice calm but unyielding. Say what you're afraid to say. For a moment, it seemed like Smith might retreat, but then something shifted. His shoulders sagged, the tension leaving him. He reached out to his mother, his hands trembling as he touched her arm. She flinched slightly, but didn't pull away. I'm sorry, Mom, Smith whispered, his voice breaking. I've been so angry, and I've taken it out on you. You didn't deserve that. Tears spilled down his mother's cheeks as she looked at him, her expression softening with emotion. Oh, Smith, she said, her voice cracking. You're my son. I've always forgiven you. But hearing you say this, it means the world. A collective exhale seemed to sweep through the bus. The tension lifted, and some passengers exchanged glances, eyes glistening with unspoken emotion. Even the teenager who had been recording the moment lowered her phone, her earlier smugness replaced by a softer look. Smith's apology still hung in the air, but he wasn't done yet. He turned back to Gaines, his voice steadier now, filled with sincerity. Thank you, Smith said, his voice carrying an earnestness that hadn't been there before. I didn't realize how much I was taking her for granted. Hearing your story, it made me see things differently. Gaines nodded, his expression softening. It's never easy to admit when you're wrong, he said quietly. But what matters is what you do next. Words are just the beginning. Smith lowered his gaze, a shadow of shame still lingering over his face. I want to do better, he said softly, looking at his mother. For her? The elderly woman placed a hand over his, her fingers trembling but warm. We'll figure it out, she said, her voice filled with both love and hope. Gaines stepped back, his towering frame retreating as the moment began to shift. He glanced around the bus, meeting the eyes of a few passengers who nodded silently, their expressions filled with respect. But just as the air seemed to clear, something unexpected broke the silence, shocking everyone. As the bus rolled to a stop at a red light, a voice from the back of the bus startled everyone. It was the elderly man who had been seated near the emergency exit, the one no one had noticed until now. He leaned forward, his voice gravelly but strong enough to carry over the hushed murmurs of the bus. Young man, the elderly man called out to Smith, his voice calm but full of conviction. You've taken the first step. Don't stop now. All eyes shifted to the older gentleman, whose weathered face reflected a lifetime of experience. He adjusted his flat cap and continued, his tone firm but not unkind. I lost my son a few years ago. We hadn't spoken in over a decade. Do you know what I'd give for just 5 minutes to tell him how much I loved him? Don't waste the time you've got. Smith's face flushed a deeper shade of red as the weight of the old man's words sank in. Tears began to well in his eyes, no longer held back by the shield of pride he'd kept up for so long. He glanced at his mother, her hand still resting gently on his. In that moment, her gaze was not one of reproach, but of deep understanding. Smith looked around the bus, seeing how many strangers had witnessed not just his shame, but now his apology as well. He stood up abruptly, clutching his mother's hand, his voice trembling but steady. "Come on, Mom," he said. "Let's get off here. I want to talk, really talk." The passengers parted to let them through, some offering soft smiles, others nodding slightly in encouragement. As Smith and his mother exited the bus fell into a hushed silence. A quiet murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, like a wave of warmth in the cool atmosphere. Gaines, watching them leave, let out a small, satisfied sigh. His expression remained unreadable, but the slightest trace of a smile tugged at his lips as the doors closed behind them. He returned to his seat, leaning back with a sense of quiet accomplishment. The teenager who had been recording the scene paused the video. She stared at it for a moment, her finger hovering over the screen, and then, without a second thought, she deleted it. "Not everything needs to go online," she muttered to her friend, who nodded in agreement, a thoughtful look on her face. The bus resumed its journey, but the atmosphere had changed. The usual hum of idle chatter and phone screens was replaced by a deeper sense of reflection. People weren't just looking out the window or scrolling mindlessly anymore. They were reflecting on their own lives, their own relationships, on family, forgiveness, and the fragility of time. As the bus neared his stop, the man sitting next to Gaines leaned over slightly, his voice low. "That was something back there," he said, gesturing toward the rear of the bus. "The way you handled that, it made me think. I haven't called my mom in weeks. I think I'll do that tonight." Gaines smiled faintly, standing as the bus came to a halt. "You should," he replied, his voice gentle but sincere. "One call can make all the difference." As he stepped off the bus and into the warm afternoon sunlight, the passengers watched him go. His quiet strength, his ability to turn an uncomfortable situation into one of profound change, had left an impression, one that would linger long after the bus had pulled away. The story serves as a reminder: time with our loved ones is precious. The words we speak, whether kind or cruel, carry weight and can shape the bonds we share. Respect, humility, and gratitude are lessons worth learning before it's too late. If this story moved you, take a moment today to reach out to someone you love. Say the words you've been meaning to say. And if you want more stories that inspire and make you think, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. Let's spread kindness together.